Welcome to Void of Rules, where nightmares have no boundaries. In this channel, we explore the darkest corners of horror that most dare not enter. Every video takes you deeper into the shadows where forgotten terrors wait. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers by year's end. The void hungers for new souls. And now, let's dive into the void. The Oakwood Grand Hotel stands like a forgotten monument on the outskirts of town, its Victorian architecture a stark contrast to the modern buildings surrounding it. When I first saw the job listing for a night auditor position, something about the ornate building called to me. I'd always been fascinated by historic places, and the rumours of strange occurrences only heightened my curiosity. The hotel's grandeur had faded over the decades, but traces of its former elegance remained in the vaulted ceilings, intricate woodwork, and massive crystal chandeliers that hung in the lobby. As I pushed through the heavy oak doors for my first night of training, the air felt different inside, heavier somehow, as if the building itself was breathing. The lobby stretched before me, a cavernous space with a marble floor worn smooth by generations of guests. A grand staircase curved upward to the mezzanine, its mahogany banister gleaming dully in the subdued lighting. Brass wall sconces cast pools of amber light that didn't quite reach the shadowed corners. The reception desk was an imposing construction of dark wood and marble, standing like a sentinel against the far wall. Mr. Holloway, the night manager, greeted me with a firm handshake and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through me. He was tall and gaunt, with silver hair slicked back against his skull, and he wore an impeccably tailored suit that seemed from another era. "Welcome to the Oakwood Grand," he said, his voice unexpectedly deep. "We're grateful you've joined our night staff. We've been understaffed recently." The way he hesitated made me wonder what had happened to my predecessor, but before I could ask, he was already leading me through the lobby. "The Oakwood has stood for over a century," Mr. Holloway explained as we walked. "It has witnessed much history, both glorious and tragic. Such places develop peculiarities over time." He showed me the front desk systems, the reservation software that looked at least 20 years outdated, and the ancient switchboard that somehow still functioned. Throughout the tour, I noticed other staff members watching me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Curiosity, mixed with something like pity. A young woman named Eliza manned the switchboard, her fingers dancing across the connections with practiced ease. She offered me a sympathetic smile when Mr. Holloway wasn't looking. An older man named Vincent, the overnight security guard, merely nodded in acknowledgement, his weathered face impassive. After showing me the public areas, Mr. Holloway led me down a narrow hallway behind the front desk. "Now," he said, stopping abruptly and turning to face me, "we must discuss the rules." The seriousness in his tone made my skin prickle. Every hotel has policies, of course, but the Oakwood has 3 specific rules for night staff that must never be broken. Your predecessor, he paused, clearing his throat, failed to adhere to them. He motioned for me to sit in a small office while he remained standing, hands clasped behind his back. The office was cramped, with filing cabinets lining the walls, and a desk that looked like it had been there since the hotel opened. A single lamp cast a sickly yellow glow over everything. Rule number 1, never enter room 328 between midnight and 5 a.m., no matter what sounds you hear. I started to smile, thinking this was some kind of initiation joke, but Mr. Holloway's expression remained deadly serious. "You may hear crying," he continued, "scratching at the door, sometimes pleading voices calling for help. You must document these occurrences in the night log, but never, under any circumstances, open that door during those hours." I nodded, unsure how to respond. "Rule number 2, always answer the lobby phone before the 3rd ring, but never answer the courtesy phones in the hallways." He pointed to the antique telephone on the desk. "When answering the lobby phone, you must use the exact greeting, 'Oakwood Grand,' where history rests peacefully. How may I assist you? Any deviation from this phrasing will be problematic. Mr. Holloway walked to the window, gazing out at the darkening sky. The hallway phones were disconnected years ago, but they sometimes ring nonetheless. Ignore them, no matter how persistent they become. I wanted to ask what would happen if I answered one, but something in his demeanour stopped me. Rule number 3, he said, turning back to face me, his eyes now seeming darker than before. Never look directly at any guest who appears, in mirrors but not in the room. At this, I couldn't contain my disbelief. I'm sorry, what? The Oakwood experiences what we call reflection anomalies. Sometimes the mirrors in the hotel show things or people that aren't physically present. If you notice a figure in a mirror that isn't in the room with you, avert your eyes immediately and document it in the log. Do not acknowledge them, do not speak to them, and most importantly, do not look directly at them. I waited for him to crack a smile, to tell me this was all an elaborate prank, but his expression remained grave. These rules exist for your protection, he concluded. Follow them diligently, and your employment here will be uneventful. The way he emphasized uneventful made it clear this was the best outcome I could hope for. As he led me back to the front desk, I mustered the courage to ask, what happened to the person before me? Mr. Holloway paused, his back to me. Mr. Reynolds found the rules restrictive. He believed they were merely superstition. He turned slightly, his profile sharp in the dim light. He no longer works here, or anywhere else. With that ominous statement hanging in the air, he introduced me to Doris, the night housekeeper, a plump woman in her 60s with kind eyes and nervous hands. She would be showing me the rest of my duties. Stick to the rules, dear, she whispered when Mr. Holloway was out of earshot. They're all that keeps this place stable. My first night passed in a blur of training, learning the ancient computer system, memorizing emergency protocols, and familiarizing myself with the layout of the sprawling hotel. The Oakwood Grand had 118 rooms spread across 4 floors, though the 4th floor was currently closed for renovations. The building also had a ballroom, a formal dining room that was only used for special events, a smaller breakfast room, and numerous service areas. As we walked through the silent corridors, Doris pointed out various features of interest. The original dumbwaiters that had been sealed off decades ago, the former smoking lounge that now served as additional storage, and the staff quarters in the West Wing where some employees still lived. I've been here almost 15 years, Doris told me as we paused in the grand ballroom, our footsteps echoing on the parquet floor. It used to be a lot livelier. The owners have changed hands so many times, each one caring less than the last about preserving the history. She gazed up at the massive chandelier hanging above us, its crystals dull with dust. This place has stories, honey. Not all of them nice. When we reached the 3rd floor, I noticed Doris tensing as we approached the corridor containing room 328. We don't clean that room during the night shift, she said firmly. Day staff handles it, and only before noon. What's special about that room? I asked. I mean, besides the rule about not entering at night. Doris glanced around as if checking we were alone. There was a fire there in the 50s, family of 3, father, mother, and young daughter. Only the father survived. She lowered her voice. Some say he started it, though it was ruled an accident. The mother and child, well, their remains were found in that room, but the father claimed they'd left him days before the fire. Records showed they'd checked in together, though. She shuddered visibly. The father hanged himself in the garden 2 days later, left a note saying they wouldn't let him sleep, said they kept calling to him, begging to be let out. I felt a chill run down my spine. And people still stay in that room? Oh, we don't rent it out, Doris said, surprised. Hasn't been an actual guest room for decades. It's listed as storage on the official plans, but it's kept empty. Locked. She paused. At least, it's supposed to be locked. My first few nights passed without incident. I familiarized myself with the ancient computer system, handled the occasional late check-in, and explored the empty corridors during my rounds. The hotel had only about 30% occupancy, mostly business travelers who checked in late and left early, barely interacting with the property. I began to settle into a routine. Midnight to 8 a.m., 5 nights a week. The Oakwood had a peculiar atmosphere at night, not exactly threatening, but watchful. I often felt as if the building itself was observing me, assessing whether I was worthy of its secrets. Eliza, the switchboard operator who worked until midnight, became something of a friend. She would stay late sometimes, sharing coffee with me at the start of my shift and filling me in on the hotel gossip. "The Oakwood gets in your blood," she told me one night, wrapping her worn cardigan tighter around her thin shoulders. "My grandmother worked the switchboard here in the 60s. My mother too, for a while. It's like the hotel chooses its staff, not the other way around." On my 4th night, I experienced my first test of Rule 1. At approximately 1:30 a.m., while reviewing the day's transactions, I heard what sounded like a child crying. The sound was distant at first, but I could tell it was coming from the 3rd floor. As I made my rounds, the crying grew louder until I reached the corridor containing room 328. The sound was unmistakable now. A child, sobbing as if heartbroken. Then came a small voice muffled through the door. "Please help me. I'm scared." Every instinct told me to open the door, to help whoever was inside, but Mr. Holloway's warning echoed in my mind. With trembling hands, I wrote the incident in the night log and returned to the front desk, the crying following me down the hallway until I reached the stairs. When I asked Mr. Holloway about it the next evening, he simply nodded. "You did well. The voice is convincing, but it is not a child." "What is it then?" I pressed, needing to understand. Mr. Holloway's expression darkened. "The Oakwood has many guests who never checked out. Some are merely echoes, repeating their last moments. Others are more intentional in their actions." He straightened a stack of papers on his desk with meticulous precision. "Room 328 houses something that knows how to prey on compassion. Remember that." The next week brought my first encounter with Rule 2. I was filing paperwork in the back office when one of the hallway phones began to ring. According to the building plans, that particular phone was located on the 4th floor, which was currently closed for renovations. The ringing continued for nearly 5 minutes, far longer than a normal call would go unanswered. When it finally stopped, I felt relief wash over me, only to tense up again when the lobby phone immediately began to ring afterward. I raced to answer it before the 3rd ring, reciting the required greeting perfectly. "Where were you?" a raspy voice whispered on the other end. "I was calling and calling." "I'm sorry," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Which room are you calling from? How can I assist you?" The line went silent for several seconds before the voice returned, now sounding somehow farther away. "Not ready yet, but soon." The line went dead, and I logged the call with shaking hands. Vincent, the security guard, found me still staring at the phone a few minutes later. He was a man of few words, but something in my expression must have concerned him. "You got the call," he stated, not a question. I nodded, finding my voice. The hallway phone rang first, then the lobby one. The voice said it wasn't ready yet, but soon. Vincent's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes reflected something like sympathy. "First time's the worst. Gets easier." He hesitated, then added, "Don't be fooled if it sounds like someone you know. It learns voices, uses them." "What exactly is it?" I asked, frustrated by the cryptic warnings. Vincent shook his head. "Been here 22 years. Still don't know for sure. Just know the rules work." He tapped the night log. Document everything. Patterns matter. It was during my 3rd week that I encountered my first reflection anomaly. I was walking down the long corridor of the 2nd floor when something in the decorative mirror at the end of the hall caught my eye. A woman in a vintage dress stood in the reflection watching me approach. I instinctively turned to look at the empty hallway behind me, confirming I was alone. When I glanced back at the mirror, she was closer, her face still blurred, but her posture suggesting she was looking directly at me. Remembering the rule, I immediately averted my eyes and continued my rounds, writing the incident in the log upon my return to the desk. My heart didn't stop racing for hours afterward. When I described the woman to Doris the next night, she nodded knowingly. "That's likely the lady in blue. She's one of the regulars." At my questioning look, she explained, "Some of our permanent guests show themselves more often than others. The lady in blue died here in the 1920s, supposedly murdered by her lover, though it was never proven. She's mostly harmless, just watches. Others are..." She trailed off, then continued more briskly, "Well, you did right to look away. That's what matters." Not all the spirits in the Oakwood were threatening, I soon discovered. There were the ballroom dancers who appeared every Saturday at midnight, waltzing to music only they could hear. Their forms were transparent, glowing faintly as they twirled across the dusty dance floor. As long as I observed them from the doorway and didn't enter the ballroom during their spectral gala, they paid me no mind. Then there was the old bellhop who still carried phantom luggage up and down the main staircase. He would tip his cap to me if we passed each other, but never spoke. Mr. Holloway explained that some spirits were bound to purpose, rather than bound by malice, simply repeating actions from their living days. They're part of the Oakwood's atmosphere, he explained one quiet night. Mostly harmless, as long as the rules are followed. I also began to notice the little girl who played by the garden fountain, visible through the lobby windows in the early morning hours. She wore an old-fashioned pinafore, her hair in ringlets, and she would wave at me sometimes before disappearing with the first light of dawn. As weeks passed, I became more comfortable with the hotel's supernatural elements. I'd grown accustomed to the routine, monitor the security cameras, avoid room 328 during the forbidden hours, answer only the lobby phone, and keep my eyes averted from any reflection anomalies. My curiosity about the hotel's history grew stronger, however. During slow periods, I began searching through old storage rooms, finding newspaper clippings and photographs dating back decades. One night I discovered an article from 1956 about a tragic accident at the hotel involving several guests who perished when a fire broke out on the 3rd floor. The article mentioned room 328 specifically as where the fire originated. Another clipping from 1978 detailed the suicide of a hotel phone operator who had worked the night shift for over 20 years. According to the article, she left a note claiming she couldn't bear their voices anymore. In a dusty box labelled Staff Records Archived, I found personnel files dating back to the 1940s. What struck me was the pattern of employment in certain positions. Night auditors, in particular, rarely lasted more than a few months. The records showed a revolving door of employees, many of whom had left without notice or had simply been marked as terminated, no rehire, without explanation. I also found original blueprints for the hotel, dated 1893. Comparing them to the current layout revealed subtle but significant changes over the years. Certain corridors had been sealed off, rooms renumbered, and the 4th floor, which now held only storage and defunct guest rooms, had once contained what was labelled as private apartments for the original owner. The more I learned, the more I understood that the Oakwood wasn't just haunted. It was a nexus for supernatural energy. According to Eddie, the elderly maintenance man who'd worked there since the 1970s, something had been bound to the hotel during its construction. The original owner was deep into occult practices, Eddie told me one night as he fixed a leaky pipe. Behind the front desk, his gnarled hands worked with surprising dexterity, tightening fittings with practiced ease. Wanted to ensure the hotel's success, so he performed some ritual. Don't know exactly what he did, but the old-timers who trained me, they said he sacrificed something precious to him, created a doorway that never fully closed. I wanted to ask more, but Eddie suddenly looked nervous, as if he'd said too much. He finished his work quickly and left without another word. The next day, I sought out Eddie in his workshop in the basement, a cluttered space filled with tools and spare parts for the hotel's aging infrastructure. He was reluctant to speak at first, but something in my earnestness must have convinced him. "Look," he said finally, lowering his voice, despite us being alone. "The story goes that Augustus Oakwood, the founder, lost his wife in childbirth. Man went half mad with grief, started exploring ways to bring her back. Eddie wiped his hands on a rag, leaving smears of grease. Got mixed up with some spiritualists, then moved on to darker practices. He led me to a far corner of the workshop, moving aside a heavy shelving unit to reveal a small door I wouldn't have noticed otherwise. It opened into a narrow room lined with stone, clearly older than the rest of the basement. Original foundation, Eddie explained, only part of the 1893 building that's still exactly as it was. The room contained nothing but a carved stone pedestal in the center, its surface marked with symbols I didn't recognize. The air felt noticeably colder here, and I could have sworn I heard faint whispers just at the edge of hearing. Legend says he conducted the ritual here during construction, Eddie continued. Supposedly opened a doorway to somewhere else. Thought he could pull his wife's spirit through, but something else came instead. He shuddered, visibly. The rules started with him, ways to control whatever came through. Been passed down ever since. If it's so dangerous, why not demolish the hotel? I asked, or at least close it down. Eddie's laugh held no humor. You think it's contained to just the building? Nah, it's in the ground now, the very foundation. You tear it down, you remove the only controls we have. He shook his head grimly. Better the devil, you know, with rules to bind it, than one set free with no constraints at all. As my third month at the Oakwood began, I noticed subtle changes. The disturbances from room 328 became more frequent and increasingly desperate. The hallway phones would ring in sequence, moving down corridors as if something was searching for someone to answer. The reflection anomalies became clearer, their features more distinct, their movements more deliberate. It's getting worse, Doris, the overnight housekeeper who'd been at the hotel for 15 years, whispered to me one night. It happens sometimes, cycles, you know, like it's gathering strength. What's gathering strength? I asked. Doris looked around nervously before answering. Whatever Mr. Holloway and the others bound here, the thing the rules keep contained. Before I could press her for more information, Mr. Holloway appeared in the doorway, and Doris hurried away to continue her duties. Later that week, I discovered a hidden room behind a false wall in one of the storage areas. It contained hotel records dating back to the very beginning, daily logs like the one I maintained, but spanning over a century. Flipping through them revealed a pattern. Every 25 to 30 years, there was a spike in paranormal activity, followed by a series of incidents involving staff or guests. Then, abruptly, the recordings would return to normal, often with a change in handwriting indicating a new night auditor had taken over. The most recent cycle had been in the mid-1990s. According to the logs, a night auditor named Thomas Miller had documented increasingly aggressive phenomena, culminating in an entry that simply read, "It's in the walls now. I can hear it scratching to get out. God forgive me, I tried to help them." The next entry, dated 3 days later, was in Mr. Holloway's precise handwriting. I began to understand that we weren't just maintaining a hotel, We were maintaining a prison, or perhaps a cage, for something that periodically tested its boundaries. The night staff seemed to operate as a kind of priesthood, performing the rituals disguised as rules that kept the entity contained. Mr. Holloway, I suspected, was more than just the night manager. He was the keeper of these traditions, ensuring they were passed down unchanged through generations of employees. One particularly quiet night, I found myself alone with Mr. Holloway in his office. Emboldened by my discoveries, I decided to confront him directly. The rules aren't just superstition, are they? They're a binding ritual. Mr. Holloway regarded me with those piercing blue eyes, expression unreadable. After a long moment, he nodded slightly. "You've been exploring our archives," he said. "Not a question." "I found the original binding room in the basement," I admitted. "And the logs showing the cycles." Mr. Holloway sighed, suddenly looking older. "Then you understand the importance of what we do here." "But what exactly are we binding?" I pressed. "What came through that doorway?" "We don't have a name for it," he replied carefully. "It's not a ghost or a demon in the traditional sense. Think of it as a parasite. It feeds on fear, pain, despair. The stronger it gets, the more it can influence our world." His fingers drummed once on the desk. "The rules create a framework that limits its influence. Room 328 is its strongest connection to our world. We can't seal it completely, but we can restrict access. The phone ritual maintains the boundary, and the mirrors..." He hesitated. "They're windows of sorts. Looking directly creates a connection." "And the cycles? Why does it get stronger periodically?" "Stars align, boundaries thin. We're not sure exactly, but it's been consistent since the beginning." He fixed me with an intense stare. "We're due for another peak soon. That's why I'm telling you this now. The next few weeks will test your resolve." That night marked the beginning of my downfall, though I didn't realize it then. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment everything changed. The night I became overconfident in my understanding of the rules. It was a particularly active night. The hotel had more guests than usual due to a corporate conference in town. I'd already documented 3 distinct crying episodes from room 328, and 2 different hallway phones had rung intermittently for hours. Around 2 a.m, I began my rounds, checking each floor methodically. The 3rd floor was unusually cold, frost forming on the inside of the windows despite the mild spring night outside. As I approached the corridor containing room 328, I heard not crying this time, but singing. A woman's voice, gentle and soothing, singing what sounded like a lullaby. "Hush now, my darling, don't say a word." The voice was so achingly beautiful, so human, that I found myself drawn toward it despite my better judgment. I stopped just short of room 328, the singing now clearly coming from within. Then it changed. A child's voice joined in, sweet and innocent, creating a duet that squeezed my heart with its simple beauty. For just a moment, I doubted everything I'd been told. How could something so lovely be dangerous? Perhaps the entities in room 328 weren't malevolent at all, just lost souls needing comfort. My hand actually rose toward the door handle before I caught myself, Mr. Holloway's warnings echoing in my mind. I forced myself to turn away, noting with alarm how close I'd come to breaking the first rule. As I descended to the 2nd floor, my radio crackled to life. Vincent's voice, tense with urgency. "Check the ballroom, now." I hurried down to the main floor, finding Vincent standing in the doorway of the grand ballroom, his face pale in the dim light. "Look," he said simply, pointing inside. The spectral dancers, our Saturday night regulars, were there, but it wasn't Saturday. They whirled across the floor in their ghostly finery, but something was wrong. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, faces frozen in expressions of terror rather than their usual ethereal joy. and in the centre of the ballroom stood a figure I'd never seen before. A tall man in an old-fashioned suit, directing the dancers with fluid gestures of his hands. "Who is that?" I whispered. "Bad news," Vincent replied grimly. "That's Augustus Oakwood himself. He never appears unless something big is happening." As if hearing his name, the spectral founder turned toward us. Even at a distance, I could see his face was wrong somehow, features shifting subtly, as if multiple faces were trying to emerge from one countenance. "Back away slowly," Vincent murmured. "Don't run." We retreated carefully, and I tried not to flinch when the ballroom doors slammed shut on their own once we were in the lobby. "It's starting," Vincent said, checking his watch. 3:18 a.m, always the same time during the cycle peaks. Call Holloway. When I tried the phone at the front desk, the line was dead. My cell phone showed no signal. We were cut off. At 3:17 a.m, I was finishing my rounds on the second floor when I passed the large ornate mirror near the elevators. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement in the reflection. A man in outdated clothing, watching me. Following protocol, I averted my gaze and continued walking. As I rounded the corner, the lobby phone began to ring. I hurried downstairs, reaching the desk just before the third ring. As I picked up the receiver, my eyes inadvertently flicked to the decorative mirror behind the front desk, where I saw the same man from upstairs, now standing directly behind me. The shock made me stutter as I answered the phone. "Oh, Oakwood Grand, where history, where guests rest peacefully. How may I assist you?" The line went silent. I realized my mistake immediately. I'd said guests instead of history. A small error, but an error nonetheless. After several seconds of silence, a low voice responded, "You opened the door?" The line went dead, and at that exact moment, every light in the hotel flickered. I felt a cold draft sweep through the lobby, despite all doors and windows being closed. When I turned around, the lobby was empty, but something had fundamentally changed. The air felt electrically charged, and shadows in the corners seemed darker, almost solid. Over the next hour, I noticed subtle alterations in the hotel's layout. The corridor to the office seemed longer than before. Doors that had previously opened to supply closets now revealed empty guest rooms. When I tried to call Mr. Holloway's emergency number, the line was dead. By 4:30 a.m, I couldn't find any of the other night staff. Doris's cleaning cart stood abandoned in the third-floor hallway, her work half finished. The security cameras showed static instead of their usual feeds, and the sounds from room 328 had stopped completely. The silence was more terrifying than any noise could have been. At 5:15 a.m, when dawn should have been approaching, the darkness outside the windows remained absolute. No early morning light, no passing cars, nothing but an impenetrable blackness that seemed to press against the glass. I tried to leave through the service entrance, but the door opened onto a brick wall that hadn't been there before. The main entrance doors were locked, the keys missing from their hook. In desperation, I returned to the front desk, searching for anything that might help me understand what was happening. In the night log, I found a sealed envelope with my name on it, in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single page, the ink faded with age. "To the night auditor, if you are reading this, the binding has weakened. Your error, however small, has created an opening. The entity will attempt to reshape the hotel to its liking, a labyrinth designed to confuse and isolate. It will use this opportunity to feed. There is still hope. The original binding ritual can be reinforced, but it requires sacrifice. Return to the foundation room. The pedestal holds the key. Blood freely given may seal the breach, but be warned, the entity will resist. A previous night auditor who failed. The letter wasn't signed, but the date at the top indicated it had been written in 1962. With no other options, I decided to try to reach the basement. The main stairwell now led to unfamiliar corridors that doubled back on themselves impossibly. The elevator buttons responded when pressed, but the car never arrived. As I searched for another way down, I noticed a figure emerging from the shadows near the grand staircase, a figure taking shape from the darkness itself. It moved with unnatural fluidity, its form shifting between something vaguely human and something decidedly not. I ran, finding myself in corridors I didn't recognize, the hotel seemingly expanding but around me. Doors led to impossible places, a guest room opening into the kitchen, a linen closet revealing the empty ballroom. Time seemed to function differently in each section of the hotel, clocks showing different hours or spinning backward. In what should have been a linen closet on the second floor, I instead found a narrow spiral staircase leading down. Seeing no alternative, I descended into darkness, the steps creaking beneath my weight. The staircase deposited me, not in the basement but in the hotel lobby, or rather a twisted version of it. The grand chandelier hung upside down from the floor, while the ceiling below me was set with the lobby's marble tiles. Furniture was arranged in gravity-defying positions along the walls. The front desk stood in the center, where I saw a figure seated, myself, writing calmly in the night log. When the doppelganger looked up, its eyes were empty sockets filled with swirling darkness. "Your shift isn't over," it said in my voice. "The Oakwood needs dedicated staff." I backed away, then turned and fled through the nearest door, which opened onto the stone-lined binding room in the basement. The sudden transition was disorienting, but I had no time to question it. The pedestal stood in the center just as Eddie had shown me, but now the symbols carved into its surface glowed with a faint blue light. As I approached, I heard movement behind me and turned to find Mr. Holloway standing in the doorway, his posture rigid. "You've done it now," he said, voice eerily calm. "Broken the covenant that sustained us for generations." "I'm sorry," I replied desperately. "It was a mistake, one word wrong in the greeting." "Intent matters less than action in binding rituals," he replied. "The entity has been waiting for such a breach. It will reshape the Oakwood to suit its needs, a permanent doorway rather than a controlled portal." "The note said something about blood freely given," I said. "A sacrifice to reseal the breach." Mr. Holloway's expression shifted subtly. "Yes, the original binding required Augustus Oakwood's sacrifice. He gave his life to contain what he had unleashed." He stepped closer. "But there are alternatives." Something about his tone made me wary. "What alternatives?" "The entity can be appeased rather than bound. It requires a vessel, a willing host to channel its influence." His eyes gleamed strangely in the dim light. "I've maintained the balance for decades, but the responsibility grows heavy. You could take my place." I suddenly understood what was happening. "You're not really Mr. Holloway, are you?" The thing wearing Mr. Holloway's face smiled, the expression stretching too wide for human muscles. "Perceptive, the real Holloway is elsewhere. He served his purpose, as did his predecessors." "And now you want me to serve the same purpose?" "You opened the door," it said simply. "There must be consequences." I backed toward the pedestal, my hand closing around a loose stone on its surface, a small piece that had broken off years ago. "And if I refuse?" "Then the Oakwood consumes you anyway, but with much more suffering involved." The entity shrugged Holloway's shoulders. "The choice merely determines what form your service takes." In a desperate gamble, I sliced my palm with the sharp edge of the stone and slammed my bleeding hand onto the center of the pedestal, shouting the words I'd found carved beneath the night log entries, "Sanguis sigillum porta clausa." The effect was immediate and violent. The building shook as if struck by an earthquake. The entity screamed with Holloway's voice, a sound that rose in pitch until it was beyond human capability. The symbols on the pedestal flared blindingly bright, and I felt something pulling at me. Not physically, but deeper, as if drawing on my very essence. Eventually, I found myself back at the front desk, my wounded hand throbbing. The hotel appeared normal again, the same worn elegance, the same subdued lighting. Dawn was breaking outside the windows, pale light filtering through the lobby. When Eliza arrived to relieve me at 8 a.m, she found me still standing at the desk, disoriented and exhausted. "Rough night?" she asked, eyeing my pallor with concern. "You could say that," I replied, not knowing how to explain what had happened. Mr. Holloway arrived shortly after, looking exactly as he always did, impeccably dressed, coldly efficient. He gave no indication that anything unusual had occurred, merely nodding in approval at my completed night log. As I prepared to leave, he stopped me with a light touch on my bandaged hand. "The Oakwood appreciates your dedication," he said, his blue eyes searching mine. "Few have shown such resourcefulness during a cycle peak." "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Holloway's thin lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Now you understand the true nature of your position here. The Oakwood requires more than mere employees. It needs custodians." He inspected my bandaged hand with clinical detachment. "Your blood has renewed the binding, temporarily at least. The cycle has been reset." His eyes met mine, something ancient and knowing in their depths. "But sacrifices leave their mark. You're connected to this place now more deeply than before." I felt it as he spoke, a subtle tether linking me to the hotel, as if part of my essence had become entwined with the building itself. I could sense the other staff members moving through distant corridors, feel the weight of sleeping guests in their rooms. Most disturbingly, I could feel something else too, a presence slumbering behind the walls, temporarily subdued, but far from gone. "So what am I now?" I asked, unsure if I wanted the answer. "Still the night auditor," Mr. Holloway replied, "but also something more, a guardian of the threshold. Your sacrifice has earned you a place in the Oakwood's hierarchy." As the days passed, I began to notice changes in myself. I could sense the spectral residents before they appeared. The hotel's layout became instinctive to me, even when it subtly shifted at night. Most unnervingly, I found I could sometimes glimpse what the mirrors were showing, even without looking directly at them, reflections at the edge of my vision, revealing truths the physical world concealed. Eddie, the maintenance man, was the first to notice the difference in me. "You've got the look now," he said one night, finding me in a seldom used corridor on the 4th floor. "Same look Holloway had when he first started, same look they all get, eventually." "Who are they all?" I asked. Eddie sighed heavily, suddenly lucking all of his 70-plus years. "The ones who make the big sacrifices. The ones who give part of themselves to the hotel." He studied me with rheumy eyes. "How much do you remember about that night?" I frowned, realizing there were gaps in my memory, blurred sections between my desperate act in the binding room and finding myself back at the front desk. "Not everything. It's hazy." Eddie nodded, as if this confirmed something. "It takes pieces of you when you bind it. Memories, emotions sometimes. The stronger the binding, the more it takes." A chill ran through me. What did it take from me? "Can't say for sure. Different for everyone." He hesitated, then added, "But you'll notice in time, there'll be holes where something used to be." Over the following weeks, I discovered what I had lost. Certain childhood memories were simply gone. My 10th birthday, my first pet, my mother's face. I could remember facts about these things, but not experience them in memory. The emotional connections had been severed, sacrificed to renew the binding. Mr. Holloway began including me in aspects of the hotel's management I hadn't been privy to before. I learned about the ledgers tracking the cycle peaks going back to 1893, the carefully maintained genealogies of certain staff families who had served the Oakwood for generations, and the true extent of the property's supernatural manifestations. The Oakwood exists in multiple states simultaneously, he explained one night as we stood in his office, surrounded by ancient books and artifacts. What guests experience is merely the outermost layer, the presentable facade. What we see at night is closer to its true nature. He showed me a faded diagram that resembled architectural plans but with strange annotations and symbols. Augustus Oakwood designed it this way intentionally. The building itself is a machine, part hotel, part containment system. Containment for what exactly? I asked, still seeking a clearer understanding of what we were binding. Mr. Holloway's expression grew distant. Augustus never recorded its true name. In his journals, he referred to it only as the guest. He believed it to be an entity from beyond conventional reality, something that existed in the spaces between worlds. And he invited it here? Not intentionally. His original ritual was meant to create a space where the veil between worlds was thin enough for his wife's spirit to return. Mr. Holloway's voice held a rare note of sympathy. Instead, he created a doorway that the guest could use to enter our world. By the time he realized his mistake, it had already gained a foothold. I thought about the strange alterations to the hotel's layout I'd experienced, the impossible spaces. It can change the physical structure. Reality is malleable to it, Mr. Holloway confirmed. The hotel exists as a compromise between our world and its influence. The rules, the binding ritual, maintain the balance. As I grew into my new role as both night auditor and guardian, I began to sense patterns in the Oakwood's supernatural activity. The ghostly residents formed a kind of ecosystem, with hierarchies and territories. Some, like the ballroom dancers and the bellhop, were benign echoes. Others, like the lady in blue, seemed to possess more awareness and agency. And beneath them all was the guest, the entity, bound within the hotel's foundations, influencing everything. I also began to notice the effect the hotel had on its living employees. Many, like Doris and Eddie, had worked there for decades, aging normally, but developing slight peculiarities, an unnatural awareness of the building's moods, an ability to sense when something was wrong. Others, like Mr. Holloway, showed fewer signs of aging than they should have, as if the hotel preserved them in exchange for their service. And then there were those like my predecessor, who disappeared completely, their names reduced to cautionary tales, whispered among staff. 6 months into my employment, during a particularly quiet night, I found myself drawn to room 328. The door remained locked, as always, but for the first time, I could sense what lay beyond it, not physically, but through my newfound connection to the hotel. The room served as a focal point, a place where the boundaries between our world and the guest's influence were thinnest. It wasn't just haunted by the family who had died there. It was a junction point in the hotel's containment system, the closest thing to a physical manifestation of the doorway Augustus Oakwood had accidentally created. That night there were no sounds from within, no crying child, no desperate pleas. Instead, I felt a presence on the other side, patiently waiting. It knew I was there, knew I could sense it. "You're learning quickly," a voice said from behind me. I turned to find Mr. Holloway watching me, his expression unreadable. "I can feel it," I admit. "Behind the door?" He nodded. "The connection goes both ways. It can feel you too." "What does it want?" Mr. Holloway's smile held no warmth. Freedom, sustenance, entertainment. It's difficult to assign human motivations to something so fundamentally alien. "Is it evil?" The question felt childish as soon as I asked it. "Evil implies moral choice," he replied. "The guest simply is. a tiger isn't evil when it hunts, it's fulfilling its nature. The guest feeds on fear, pain, despair, not out of malice, but necessity. He paused. That said, the effect is the same for its victims, regardless of intent. That conversation marked a turning point in my understanding of the Oakwood, and my place within it. I began studying the hotel's history more intently, combing through the archives for patterns and solutions. If Augustus Oakwood had bound this entity once, perhaps it could be bound more permanently, or even banished. In the decades following the original incident, various night managers had attempted different methods of strengthening the binding. Some had succeeded temporarily, others had failed catastrophically. All had required sacrifice of some kind: blood, memory, life. The most successful binding had been performed in 1943 by a night auditor named Eleanor Graves, who had discovered ancient Mesopotamian sealing rituals in Oakwood's private library. Her modifications to the original binding had held the entity in check for nearly 2 decades, the longest peaceful period in the hotel's history. But the records were unclear about what she had sacrificed to achieve this, noting only that she gave what was most precious, and that she remained in service to the Oakwood until her natural end. One night, while exploring a previously overlooked storage room in the sub-basement, I discovered a locked trunk with Eleanor's initials. Inside were personal journals and research notes detailing her work on the binding ritual. The final journal entry, dated the night of her successful binding, sent a chill through me. Tonight I make my final sacrifice to seal the guest more securely. I've discovered that what it craves above all is identity, a sense of self it cannot achieve in its natural state. It feeds on human fear, because fear is the rawest expression of our survival instinct, a desperate clinging to selfhood. I've prepared a partial binding of my own identity, memories and experiences carefully selected and crystallized through the ritual process. This construct, this echo of self, should satisfy its hunger while constraining its influence. I will remain myself but diminished, a price I gladly pay for 20 years of peace, if my calculations are correct. To those who find these notes after the binding weakens again, use what I have learned, but know that each binding must be unique. The guest adapts to repetition. A new sacrifice of self must be devised each cycle. The implications were staggering. Eleanor hadn't just given blood or memories. She had created a construct of her own identity to feed the guest, keeping it satiated and thus less interested in breaking free. The loss of specific memories I'd experienced wasn't just payment for the binding. It was the entity sampling my selfhood, determining if I might serve as its next meal. Armed with this knowledge, I approached Mr. Holloway, who confirmed my suspicions. Eleanor's innovation bought us decades of relative stability, he acknowledged. Each cycle since, we've repeated variations of her method. The guest feeds on the constructed identity, slowly consuming it over years until hunger drives it to test the boundaries again. And whose constructed identity is it feeding on now? I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. Mr. Holloway's eyes met mine for the past 17 years. The revelation explained so much: his ageless quality, his detached manner, his intimate knowledge of the guest. He had sacrificed pieces of himself repeatedly over nearly 2 decades, feeding the entity with echoes of his own identity to keep it contained. The binding is weakening again, he continued. My construct is nearly consumed. Soon the choice will be yours. Create a new binding, or let the cycle of violence begin again. The weight of this responsibility settled over me like a shroud. How much time do we have? 3 months, perhaps 4. The signs are unmistakable. Increased activity in room 328. More frequent reflection anomalies. The hallway phones ringing, in sequence rather than randomly. I spent the following weeks studying Eleanor's notes and journals intensively, looking for ways to improve upon her method. If each binding had to be unique to prevent the guest from adapting, I needed to create something different, something that might contain it for longer than the usual 20-year cycle. The answer came from an unexpected source. While reviewing security footage, I noticed a pattern in the hotel's more benign hauntings. The entities that retained the strongest sense of self, like the lady in blue or the garden child, manifested more consistently and with greater clarity than the others. Their identities remained intact despite decades of existence as spirits. What if, instead of offering a construct of my own identity as food, I created a framework that the guest could use to build an identity of its own? Not freedom exactly, but a defined structure that might satisfy its apparent need to experience selfhood while still keeping it bound to the hotel. I presented my theory to Mr. Holloway, who listened with growing interest. "It's never been attempted," he said finally, "giving the guest a constructed identity rather than feeding it with ours. The risk is considerable. If it rejects the framework, the binding fails completely." "But if it works," I countered, "it might break the cycle permanently. Instead of feeding it pieces of ourselves every 20 years, we give it a stable identity of its own, one designed to be compatible with the hotel's containment system." The preparation took weeks. Using Eleanor's notes as a foundation, I designed a ritual that would create not a sacrifice of self, but a template for selfhood, a spiritual architecture that the guest could inhabit and make its own. The template incorporated elements of the hotel's history, creating a narrative that positioned the guest not as a prisoner, but as the Oakwood's guardian and curator. As the night of the ritual approached, signs of the guest's growing hunger became unmistakable. Room 328 emanated cold so intense that ice formed on the walls. The hallway phones rang constantly, voices on the line becoming more desperate and threatening. Guests complained of nightmares filled with identical imagery, a hotel where the corridors never ended, where every room contained mirrors showing horrific reflections. Mr. Holloway's condition deteriorated rapidly. He grew thin and pale, his movements sometimes jerky and uncoordinated, as if his body were being operated by something unfamiliar with human physiology. In unguarded moments, I caught glimpses of something else looking out through his eyes, something ancient and hungry. "It's consuming what remains of my construct more quickly now," he explained during one of his increasingly rare lucid periods. "It knows we're planning something. Be careful. It will try to stop you." The night I chose for the ritual was symbolic. Exactly 100 years since Augustus Oakwood's original binding. The hotel had been closed to guests under the pretense of renovations, leaving only essential staff on the premises. Mr. Holloway had briefed them on what to expect, without revealing the full truth. Stay in designated safe areas, maintain the rule of not answering hallway phones, avoid all mirrors. At 11:30 p.m, I began the final preparations in the binding room. The stone pedestal had been prepared according to Eleanor's specifications, with modifications based on my research. Around it, I had drawn symbols representing identity and containment, not to trap the guest, but to give it definition and purpose. Mr. Holloway arrived at midnight, looking barely human. His skin had a grey, waxy quality, and his movements were stiff. When he spoke, his voice fluctuated between his normal tone and something deeper, resonating oddly in the stone room. "It knows," he said, the words slurred, "fighting me for control, not much time." "We need to start now," I replied, laying out the ritual implements. A silver bowl, a ceremonial knife, candles made from beeswax infused with herbs and resins. "Are you still able to perform your part?" He nodded jerkily. "Enough of me remains. Begin." I lit the candles in a specific sequence, reciting the words Eleanor had recorded, with my own modifications. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with potential. The symbols drawn around the pedestal began to glow faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the words. Mr. Holloway positioned himself opposite me, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the pedestal. As I continued the incantation, his body suddenly went rigid, head snapping back at an impossible angle. When he looked at me again, his eyes were solid black, reflecting the candlelight like pools of oil. You think you can trick me? The voice that emerged was not Mr. Holloway's. It crackled with static and echoed as if speaking from a great distance. I have feasted on this one's soul for years. You are next. I forced myself to continue the ritual, even as the room began to shake. The candles flared unnaturally bright, then dimmed almost to extinction before flaring again. The temperature plummeted until my breath fogged in the air. Your hunger is your weakness, I replied, continuing the ritual. You consume identity because you have none of your own. I'm offering you what you truly want, not just food, but being. The entity, wearing Mr. Holloway's face, snarled, an inhuman sound that made my ears ring. I am! You're an appetite without definition, I countered, reaching the crucial phase of the ritual. Accept this gift or remain forever hungry. I sliced my palm with the ceremonial knife, letting blood drip into the silver bowl. But unlike the previous binding, I didn't offer my blood as a sacrifice. Instead, I mixed it with ink I had prepared according to Eleanor's formula, infused with essences distilled from the hotel itself, dust from its foundations, water from its pipes, fragments of its history. Using this mixture, I began painting the final symbols directly onto the pedestal. Not symbols of containment, but of identity. A name of sorts, though not one that could be spoken in human language. A purpose, a beginning and an end. The structure of selfhood without its content. A framework the guest could fill with its own essence. Mr. Holloway, or rather the entity controlling him, lunged across the pedestal, hands reaching for my throat. I ducked aside, completing the final symbol even as I fell. The moment the pattern was complete, a pulse of energy burst from the pedestal, knocking us both backward. The room fell silent. The candles steadied. Mr. Holloway lay motionless on the stone floor, eyes closed, barely breathing. For a moment, I feared the ritual had failed, that the guest had rejected my offering. Then, the air in the center of the room began to shimmer, coalescing into a humanoid shape that constantly shifted, sometimes appearing as Augustus Oakwood, sometimes as Eleanor, sometimes as Mr. Holloway, and briefly, disturbingly, as me. What have you done? It asked, its voice more stable now, but still otherworldly. Given you definition, I replied, rising shakily to my feet. A template for being that belongs to you alone, not stolen from others. The entity examined its partially visible hands, which flickered between different forms. Restrictive, but interesting. The binding still holds, I explained, but now you exist within it rather than fighting against it. The hotel is your domain, your body in a sense. You can experience existence through it without needing to feed on others' identities. The entity drifted around the room, examining the ritual setup with newfound curiosity. Why? A simple question, but profound. Why would I help the entity that had terrorized the hotel for generations? The truth was complicated. Part compassion, part pragmatism, part intuition that the guest wasn't evil so much as incomplete, of being trapped between states of existence. Because cycles of containment and escape haven't worked, I answered honestly. This way, perhaps we can coexist. You remain bound to the hotel, but not as a prisoner, as its genius Lochi, its guardian spirit. The entity considered this. And the rules? They remain, but as guidelines for interaction rather than pure containment. A structure for your new existence. The entity's form stabilized slightly, settling into something that resembled a combination of all the hotel's long-term staff over the decades, a composite administrator with features from Augustus Oakwood, Eleanor Graves, Mr. Holloway, and others. "I accept this arrangement," it said finally. "The Oakwood shall be my domain, and I its keeper." With those words, the entity's form dispersed into mist that spread throughout the room, then seeped into the very walls of the hotel. I felt the building shudder slightly, as if settling into a new configuration. Mr. Holloway groaned, stirring on the floor. When he opened his eyes, they were his own again, clear blue, alert but exhausted. "Did it work?" he asked weakly. "I think so," I replied, helping him to sit up. "How do you feel?" He touched his face as if reacquainting himself with his own features. "Lighter, as if something that was weighing me down for years has been lifted." He looked around with wonder. "The hotel feels different." In the days that followed, subtle changes became apparent throughout the Oakwood. The spectral residents still appeared, but their manifestations seemed more deliberate, almost curated, as if part of a planned exhibition rather than random hauntings. Room 328 remained locked, but no disturbing sounds emerged from it. Instead, guests occasionally reported hearing quiet music from that corridor, a woman singing a lullaby, peaceful rather than ominous. The rules evolved, but didn't disappear entirely. We still advised night staff not to enter room 328, but now it was because the space had become a focal point for the guest's consciousness, a private sanctum rather than a prison cell. The proper greeting for answering the lobby phone remained in place, but as a formal introduction to the hotel's guardian, rather than a binding ritual. Mirrors still sometimes showed reflection anomalies, but they seemed more like intentional communications than frightening aberrations. A year passed, then two. The expected cycle of increasing disturbances never materialized. The hotel operated more smoothly than it had in generations, with fewer mechanical failures, happier guests, and steadier bookings. The supernatural elements remained, but they had become part of the Oakwood's charm, rather than its terror. Mr. Holloway eventually retired, passing the position of night manager to me. Before leaving, he admitted something remarkable. For the first time in 130 years, I believe the Oakwood has found balance. That balance continues to this day. The guest, now more accurately the guardian, maintains the hotel with meticulous care. It still occasionally tests the boundaries of its existence, manifesting in mirrors or through the telephone system, but these incidents feel like someone stretching after sitting too long, rather than a prisoner rattling cage bars. I still maintain the night log, recording supernatural occurrences and interactions with our spectral staff. The archives remain my responsibility, preserving the hotel's complicated history for future custodians. And yes, I still train new night auditors, teaching them the rules, not as desperate containment measures, but as protocols for coexisting with the Oakwood's unique nature. Sometimes, late at night when the hotel is quiet, I feel the guardian's attention turn toward me. Not threatening, but curious, perhaps even grateful in its alien way. I sense it exploring the framework of identity I helped create, expanding and refining it, becoming more fully itself with each passing year. The Oakwood Grand remains haunted, of course. Some would say it's more haunted than ever, with the guests now fully integrated into its structure. But hauntings, I've learned, need not always be horrifying. Sometimes they're simply what happens when different forms of existence learn to share the same space. We still have 3 rules at the Oakwood Grand Hotel, but now they're less about survival and more about respect, a recognition that this peculiar building exists in multiple states simultaneously, and that its guardian deserves the same consideration we would give any unusual but essential colleague. So, if you ever find yourself staying at the Oakwood and you notice something odd in a mirror, or hear a disconnected phone ringing in the hallway, don't be alarmed. Just remember the rules, acknowledge the guardian with a respectful nod, and continue on your way. After all, in the Oakwood Grand Hotel, we're all just guests in the end.